The main difference, at least in my experience, between the ordinary state of consciousness and the meditative state of consciousness, which based on introspection and contemplation, is the sense of agency one has with respect to one's own experience. We can be observed as our thoughts run and simply happen, when the observer is the self. In this way, we can gain an interesting insight about human cognition, psychology, and neurophenomenology. But in some meditative traditions, the progress go forwards into the state of the self actively engaged in this realm of higher consciousness as an agent with a free will. Here, I would like to emphasize the role of hearing in Hebrew mysticism and to draw first lines toward thinking of its possible contribution of that to contemporary understanding of mind and body and the inquiry of consciousness. I would like to quote here Varela, Thompson, and Roche in their principal book, The Embodied Mind. For the moment, we wish simply to emphasize the deep tension in our present world between science and experience. In our present world, science is so dominant that we give it the authority to explain even when it denies what is most immediate and direct our everyday immediate experience. Thus, most people will hold an fundamental truth, the scientific account of matter space, as collections of atomic particles, while treating what is given in the immediate experience with all of its richness as less profound and true. Therefore, we should begin our inquiry within oneself. There are two different qualities of or vectors or functions of attention: listening and intention. Listening is a way of perceiving, of passively taking in contact. Intention is actively pointing towards something from inside out, but with some specific designed or shaped state of being. The cognitive function that is the traveler through the line between self and object is intention, when the actor of this process is the self. All these states of mind are not relied on sight. It is a blind experience. But do we hear anything through this kind of experience? I would like to share with you some thoughts about the role of auditory experience in the Hebrew tradition. We should begin our inquiry with a few questions. The first relates to the famous declaration of the people of Israel when Moses makes a covenant between God and them in Exodus 24. And they said, Kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh v'nishma. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do and obey. But the original verb is not obey. It is an interpretation to the word we will hear, nishma. Na'aseh, we will do, v'nishma, we will hear. So the odd question arises, what does this kind of process mean that starts with doing and then moves to hearing? Should not it be done in the reverse order? First hearing, then doing? We will return to this point in a moment, but let us think of another important Hebrew phrase that is traditionally said every day, at least 3 times a day. This Deuteronomic phrase is perhaps the only Hebrew mantra, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Elohenu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What did they hear? What does the Hebrew speaker hear when he says this phrase? The third point I want to emphasize here is the term used in Hebrew culture to describe the esoteric tradition. The term is sod, a secret, a term that refers to an auditory content. But does it refer to a distinguished content content per se that has been passed down secretly from generation to generation? I'm not sure. For this, we have the term Kabbalah, which is receiving. Based on the texts, I'm arguing that Sod refers to immediate mystical content that the Kabbalist receives as direct experience and qualifies as indispensable without any attribution to previous human authority. The fourth and final question I would like to raise goes back to the Torah again. In the revelation that took place at Sinai, the Torah states, "Vayis'u merefidim vayavo'u midbar Sinai, vayachanu bamidbar, vayihan sham Yisrael keneged ahar." Translation. And when they had departed from Refidim and come into the wilderness of Sinai, they encamped in the wilderness, and Israel encamped there before the mountain. The first encamped is in the plural, and the second is singular. The great commentator Rashi says encamped as a one man with one heart. In the next chapter of the Torah, after the 10 testimonies given, it is written, וכל העם רואים את הקולות ואת הלפידים ואת כל השופר, and all the people perceive the thunderings and the lightnings and the voice of the horn. What is it this synesthesia? And does it have anything to do with our topic? Let us now try to answer these questions. As I understand it, all these questions have much to do with the most important point of Hebrew mysticism that distinguishes it from other traditions: revelation within a crowd at Sinai. The Kabbalists follow the tradition of revelation as it took place at Sinai through sound in the Midrash and exegetic corpus on Bible from Judea in the 1st century Common Era. There is a keyword to express fine and absolute understanding. Shomea ani, I am hearing, mean that an experience of deep and direct understanding based on listening. According to an ancient Hebrew tradition, this tradition continues to the medieval Kabbalists when they connect the second Sephirah, Binah, which means understanding or thinking process, Binah, with the ears. But what path leads the mystic to this understanding? For the Kabbalists, the answer is simple. They must participate to deal practically with the subject. There is no theoretical distance between the mystic and the universe. Deep understanding goes from deep listening, which in turn involves intention. The rabbinic scholars of the Middle Ages who addresses the issue of kavanah, intention, say that every commandment that involves speech, and especially the saying of Shema Israel, requires intention in order to fulfill obligation. The kavanah is the act of being involved through an activation of the auditory system. Let me now turn to the structural or procedural question. Where does this state of active intention begins? In her innovative study of vision and speech in the mystical experience of Kabbalah, Haviva Pedaya argues that the main aspiration of Ashkenazi Hasidim is to return to the revelatory experience of hearing that occurs at the height of visual experience. Holiness, she said, on the level of revelation appears as hearing. And this is the third point I would like to make. When the mystic reaches the edge of his cognitive experience as a seer and is not bound by what he sees through his eyes, but can be in blind awareness, he enters the realm of auditory mystical experience. Now we should pay attention to the role of self and the body, since hearing is bodily active. We mentioned the revelation at Sinai and Rashi interpretation of the singular reference to the Israeli people having one heart and hearing the same thing, let's say with same qualia. This leads us to think about limits of subjective consciousness. Is it possible to experience this kind of boundary crossing? From a phenomenological point of view, there are many witnesses to this kind of experience these days, especially in ayahuasca and other shamanic rites, and perhaps in deep ecology approaches to group studies as well. In my eyes, or in my ears, the most important feature of the mystical experience in Kabbalah is the awareness of the personality of God, with a strict prohibition of visual imagination of him. When the mystic describes his experience of God in terms of an encounter with the persona that is the ultimate other, but at the same time, the experience that is closest to oneself, this says something very important about how he experiences his own limits of consciousness in a way that we cannot yet describe scientifically. Perhaps we should focus an inquiry on hearing as the cognitive platform of the transpersonal experience. Our final point is the body, the root of spatial experience and subjective experience. One of the most important explanations of the Kabbalists for their innovative part of knowledge is the Job phrase, Mi besari eheze Eloha. In my flesh, I shall see God. The body is the space where the deeper investigation of the mystic takes place. We do not have enough time to go into this subject in depth, but there is one point I would like to make. The conscious split we have made between our knowledge, our scientific mind, and our first-person experience is, as I understand it, connected to our separation from our body. Our unreasonable conception of consciousness as disembodied superimposes itself on our existence without our awareness of our bodily aspect as a subject. We should rethink ourselves as theorists, a term that, and I would like to say a way of thinking, a belief derived from the Greek theoria, meaning sight. A conceptual system organized around visionary terms is very limited as a paradigm that wants to deal with the body. Just think of the inner body. Which do we have a closer relationship to? Our lungs or our hands? And which of the two is more me, myself? But we do hear sounds from within our bodies. As a musician, I'm aware of how music affects my body from the inside out, and as a singer, how I produce sound from within it. But perhaps the most important lesson I have learned are in the mystical practice, in yoga and in a prayer, when the whole noisy world breaks into my existence, into my physical space. The self cannot see, rather is here. We will close our journey with a quote from Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Contemplation. By means of 32 wondrous paths of wisdom, God, carved out the 10 Sefirot are the basis, and the 22 letters are the foundation. The 10 Sefirot are the basis, like the number of the 10 fingers, 5 opposite 5, and the covenant of the unique one is exactly in the middle, in the covenant of the tongue and circumcision of the flesh. We may still do not have the language for this kind of everyday experience, nor have we developed logical, scientific methods for this kind of inquiry. But few ancient cultures have. Modern Western science has already recognized the Buddhist traditions as scientific partners. But that is not enough. We have more to discover. There is not a single superfluous culture, especially when we study human consciousness. All we have to do is to open our ears.